Good evening, everyone. Welcome to St Patrick's College, Maynooth for the Gilmartin lecture. My pleasant task this evening is simply to welcome you. I'm sure an engaging and interesting session will be had by all. In a moment, Professor Ryan will introduce our guest speaker, Professor William Cook. We're delighted to have you here, and it's been nice to share your company in these last few days. It's good that you have taken the trouble and the time to be with us. We're delighted to welcome you to these parts. I also want to just take the opportunity to say a word of thanks to Professor Ryan for his industry and energy. He is a veritable dynamo in terms of research and publication, and indeed organising added value events such as the Gilmartin lecture, the Chorus lecture, and other events which we have through the year. So it's a great opportunity for us to share, to dialogue, and to engage with a broader community than the college, and indeed to do so again in terms of the published documents. So well done to Professor Ryan and to those who have assisted him in this evening in preparing this lecture. Welcome one and all. I wish you a very pleasant and enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Well, bhfuair géad fáilte a rís chuig coláiste fáraigh Maynooth ar an ócáid speisialta seo a nacht. You're all very warmly welcome to our very special event tonight, which is the Professor Thomas Gilmartin Lecture. Tonight's lecture is held in honour of Professor Thomas Gilmartin, a Sligo man who was born in 1857 and ordained a priest of a Conry diocese in 1881. 5 years later, in 1886, he was appointed Professor of Ecclesiastical History here at St Patrick's College in Maynooth. But his tenure was not to last for very long, for tragically, he would die of consumption in 1892 at just 35 years of age. In that short 6 years that he spent as professor here, though, he managed to write 2 volumes of a manual of church history, which proved to be a remarkably successful textbook. A 3rd volume was planned, but regrettably never got to be published. The copyright from the first 2 volumes later formed the basis of a prize fund for students pursuing studies in ecclesiastical history. This year, some students will once again submit a special assignment on the topic of Francis of Assisi in a bid to compete for the Gilmartin Prize. Maynooth has always had a very strong tradition of teaching and research in church history. I think especially of our much loved and much missed colleague, Monsignor Patrick Corish, who taught for so many years here, both in the theology faculty in church history and also in the Department of Modern History. I think too that Monsignor Corish and Professor Thomas Gilmartin would be pleased to hear that in September coming in 2014, we are launching a Taught Masters in the History of Christianity, something that we are going to offer in collaboration with our academic partners here, with the Department of History and the Department of Early Irish, in addition to the Russell and John Paul II libraries. So it's a very exciting initiative, and we're looking forward to it very much. But that brings me to our speaker tonight and our topic. Professor William Cook is the Distinguished Teaching Professor of History at the State University of New York at Geneseo, where he has taught since 1970. He earned his bachelor's degree from Wabash College and was then awarded Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Lehman fellowships to study medieval history at Cornell University, where he earned his PhD under renowned medieval historian Brian Tierney, whose work on the origins of papal infallibility is well known, even beyond academic circles. Professor Cook's dissertation was on Peter Payne, theologian and diplomat of the Hussite Revolution. Professor Cook has taught courses in ancient and medieval history, the Renaissance and Reformation periods, and the Bible and Christian thought. Since 1983, Professor Cook has directed numerous seminars for school teachers for the National Endowment for the Humanities. His books include Images of St. Francis of Assisi and Francis of Assisi, The Way of Poverty and Humility. He has contributed to the Cambridge Companion to Giotto and has edited and contributed to The Art of the Franciscan Order in Italy. His student textbook, The Medieval World View, published by Oxford University Press, which he co-wrote with Ron Herzman, is now in its third edition. Among his many awards, Professor Cook has received the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. In 1992, the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education named him New York State's Professor of the Year. In 2003, he received the first ever Cara Award for Excellence in the Teaching of Medieval Studies from the Medieval Academy of America. But I first came across Professor Cook as a lecturer on the Great Courses series of the Teaching Company, an American company which produces CDs and DVDs of courses covering a wide range of university disciplines, and which I can tell you has helped to shorten my long commute from Tipperary to work enormously over the past number of years. It has been a particular pleasure to finally meet a man whose voice I'd come to be so familiar with as a virtual travelling companion in my car. Apart from his academic interests, Professor Cook is an irrepressible globe-trotter. When he departs from here on Wednesday, he will journey to Florence, then Chartres, moving from there to Cappadocia in Turkey, and then travelling extensively in India and Nepal before ending up in Beijing via Bangladesh. And all the while delivering a number of lecture presentations on the way. We are particularly grateful to you, Professor Cook, that you've agreed to make Maynooth a very special stop on your journey. Tonight's lecture is entitled Francis, the Saint and the Pope, Translating the Charism of Assisi. I give you Professor William Cook.
I originally came from the state of Indiana before I moved to New York, and one of the things we pride ourselves on is what we call Hoosier hospitality. People from Indiana are known as Hoosiers. Well, I feel like we've all been one-upped by the hospitality I've experienced here at Maynooth, and I'm really appreciative of the invitation and of all the wonderful conversations and sightseeing that I've done, guided by some really wonderful experts that I've come to know in these days. I do look forward to going to Florence. I look forward to great pasta and a chance to glimpse at Michelangelo's David and a few other things, but I doubt if I'll receive the same hospitality. So I want to thank you who are here, and especially those who have been my host and fellow eaters in a much to be respected refectory here. Well, I want to start tonight with a very big problem and then try to focus that problem in certain ways. And the problem is, how and what do we learn from the past? I often tell my students who are thinking about studying history that it's easier to be a mediocre mediocre student of history than it is to be a mediocre student of physics. Because nobody ever gets a 0 on a history test. Well, you might get a 0 on a physics or perhaps a math test. And so if you want to be mediocre, history is probably easier than physics. If you want to be really good, history is every bit as hard as physics. It's different, and it requires different skills, but it's every bit as difficult to do the research and then to add the disciplined imagination that goes with making history interesting and useful. Because, after all, we're dealing with different people in different times, and of course, the more remote we are in time and place with regard to the people we're studying, the more difficult that becomes. There's an old cliche that says history is a foreign country. Well, in some ways that's true, but if history is a foreign country, then history of the Middle Ages, for example, is not Canada or England or the United States or France. It is Bangladesh or Zimbabwe. It's a very different foreign country. And so one of the questions is, how are we able to deal with people and institutions and presuppositions so different than the ones we have and that we respect and we urge others to adopt? How can we take people seriously who start in such different places and go such different directions? Well, that's a particular problem for Christians. Because after all, Christians believe that at a particular moment in time and in a particular place, God took human form. The incarnation, as we can tell by the Christian calendar, is a central event in Christian history. And yet, that event took place more than 2,000 years ago and very far away from you as well as from me in Western New York. It took place in a remote backwater of the Roman Empire. It took place in a different cultural setting, a different geographical setting, and as I sometimes have to remind Americans, Jesus didn't speak English. I once was hitchhiking in college and got into an argument with the guy who was driving, and I decided to drop that argument for good reasons. But we need to just remember how foreign that world is that God chose to enter. And so the question is, how do we ourselves get into that world? How do we understand it? I heard a very good sermon here on Sunday morning that used history to explain a phrase we hear and even use sometimes without probably understanding it very well. That is when Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." You know, we think of something coming out of a Morton's box. And as it turns out, it means something very different than that. And without the historical understanding of what that would have meant to people that Jesus was speaking to in Palestine in the 1st century AD, we lose a lot of the meaning and value of those particular words. Now, of course, we are fortunate as Catholics in many ways because we have a number of good guides. Of course, we have the guide of Scripture. We have the guide of the church. We have the guide of our parish priest who preached to us every Sunday morning and helped to open up some of these texts from both Hebrew Scripture and Christian Scripture. A few years ago in the United States, I don't know whether this spread to Ireland or not, there was a big movement called the WWJD movement. Does this ring a bell with anybody? And you'd see people with WWJD shirts and WWJD hats. And WWJD is the question, what would Jesus do? And so you would be talking about some issue and somebody would say to you, WWJD. And of course, so often the answer is not very easy. Jesus never talked about nuclear power. And Jesus never talked about a lot of the other specific things that we worry about. Global warming is something he didn't talk about directly. And he didn't talk about capitalism directly. He didn't talk about socialism directly. Didn't talk about democracy directly. So how do we learn from a person who grew up in such a different world, even if that person is indeed divine? And let me suggest that in addition to the ways I've suggested, one of the things that Catholics and Orthodox, and to a great extent Anglicans have, is the guidance of the saints. Because although the saints are all sinners like us, and all in need of God's grace, they live lives, to use a phrase that comes from the canonization process, of heroic virtue. And so we have these models to look at, and they help us to see how a sinner successfully deals with sin, deals with his or her own weaknesses, and lives a life of heroic Christian virtue. And that's a wonderful thing. But the saints are difficult too. Let me illustrate. One saint we might want to look at today, on the 10th of February, is the saint of the day, if you will, Saint Scholastica. Well, first of all, probably you don't know much about her, and that's because nobody knows much about her. There are even people who've suggested she might not exist. She is the sister of St. Benedict, and she was an abbess of a monastery near where Benedict was a monk. But we really know very little about her and about her life. And, you know, after all, 6th century nun in Italy is a pretty distant way from being a 21st century person living in Ireland, or in my case, in Western New York. Now, one of the things we can fall back on is there are other saints of the day as well. We have more than one saint per day. After all, we have more than 365 saints. So let me suggest some of the others that you might look at today. There's St. William of Malaval. He was an unsuccessful abbot who later on was the founder of an order of hermits in Italy in the 12th century. There's St. Ostroberta, who was a 7th century visionary, but alas, none of her visions has been recorded. So these are interesting people, and I would suggest that all three of these could teach us something if we explore and think and ponder and pray about it and whatever. But on the surface, they don't seem to have much to say to us. And therefore, even this whole notion that we have this communion of saints, something that's very real and palpable, as we know from the words of the Mass, nevertheless, sometimes those saints fail to reach us in some way. They don't always guide us as we would like to be guided. It's not only WWJD is a tough question, it's certainly a tough question, what would Scholastica do? And I don't think we know very much the answer to that question. Now, where do we go from here? Well, I would suggest that many people have their own, I would call it a team of saints. Right? These are saints who, for example, share a profession with you. Thomas Aquinas, patron saint of scholars, for example, or share a location with you. Irish are better off than Americans in that one. We have to scrounge for who walked around our part of the world and is now a saint, but luckily the Irish don't. But we have those folks. We have folks we might invoke because of a disease we have that they're invoked for, and we become close to them. We learn more about them. We seek their guidance and not just their intercession. We might choose the saint of our birthday. I'm lucky I get an apostle. That's only true for 12 out of every 365 people born. And so we sort of form, if you will, our own team of saints, and we use them as intercessors, as models. We explore them more closely. And I think that's a good thing for everyone to do. But let me suggest that one thing we can say is there are certain saints in the church, and I'm now talking about non-biblical saints. I'm not talking about our Blessed Mother. I'm not talking about Peter and Paul. But of those saints that come from post-biblical times, probably the most universally loved and admired of them all is Francis of Assisi. And I think that's pretty evident simply from looking at some statistics. There are more books written about St. Francis than any saint, for example. There are countless schools, hospitals, animal shelters named for St. Francis. That in many countries, including mine, Francis is the most popular boys' confirmation name. And at least for Americans, great cities are named after Francis and even buildings that Francis loved. In the former case, of course, that's San Francisco in California. In the latter case, we need to remember that Francis's favorite church on earth was Our Lady of the Angels, or as the last part of that would go in Spanish, Los Angeles, and therefore Los Angeles is named for the portiuncle of this little church that Francis loved and the little church where Francis died. But Francis, too, seems remote, because 13th century Italy was a very different place than 21st century Ireland or America or anywhere else in the world, for that matter. And yet, I think if we look to see how Francis lived the gospel life, how he answered the question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were living in 13th century Italy, and I think we would all agree he answered it extraordinarily successfully, then perhaps we can use his mediation, not just intercession, but mediation, to help to understand the principles by which he was able to live out the gospel life in a world very different from the world Jesus lived in. Now, he wasn't quite as long ago, quite as far away. But we need to remember, for example, that Francis lived closer to our time than he did to Jesus' time. After all, 1,200 years is a big gap in time between when you live and when Jesus lived. Francis was born in 1181 or 2 and died in 1226. And so Francis is a particularly good saint to look to. His popularity, it seems to me, is well earned. And of course, that popularity has gotten new fame recently because, obviously, the choice of Cardinal Bergoglio's papal name. But let me suggest that, in some ways, when we actually look at Francis and think about what are the most common things people know about Francis, this too gets pretty hard. Okay, Francis preached to birds. How many statues have you seen with him having birds perched on his shoulders, after all? Francis tamed a wolf, the Wolf of Gubbio. Again, one of the most famous stories about Francis. Okay, what does that tell me about how to live my life in the 21st century? Am I supposed to stop the first flock of pigeons on the college campus and have a chat with them? Am I supposed to have a conversation, an exhortation with a particularly vicious dog next door? Obviously, that's not what we need to take from Francis. We need to be less literal and more imaginative. And how do we do that? Well, let me suggest that I think historians and people interested in history, let alone people who aren't interested in history, make two big mistakes when approaching the past. One is the mistake of being so bogged down in the information they've assembled that it becomes the object of the inquiry. They're somehow just gathering facts for their own sake, a kind of antiquarianism. On the other hand, for people who say, the only reason I would ever find the past interesting is because I can learn from lessons I can apply to the modern world, and that's the only thing that matters, chances are those people aren't very careful with the facts, with the research, and that therefore they use the history as a way to justify positions they probably reached independently of any kind of historical inquiry or research. So we want to make neither one of those mistakes. In other words, we need to do our homework if we're to profit from the life of St. Francis as Christians, as Catholics. But we also then need to use what we learn imaginatively and creatively because we're applying it in a radically different set of circumstances from where Francis came from. And so that's a task, it seems to me, we have. So let me approach this in this way. Let me tell you some things about the 13th century when Francis was alive and see if they seem relevant to your life. I'm going to list 5 things. Number one, it was the era of the Crusades. In fact, Francis joined for a while the people who were fighting the 5th Crusade in Egypt. Most people, by far the most people in Italy at the time of Francis were illiterate. Probably 80 to 90% of the people in Italy in Francis's day were directly engaged in agriculture. By the way, I always ask my students, what's the current number in the United States? If it was 80 to 90% in medieval Italy, what is it now? In the United States, the answer is 1.5%. And with that, we feed ourselves and at least a little bit of the rest of the world. A third thing is most of the economy in Francis's day was a barter economy. And finally, and see if this doesn't sound different than the world, at least the world in the United States, I assume here too, virtually everybody went to Mass every Sunday. Well, that isn't a world very much like our world. But any historian knows the relevance of the past, in the best sense of that word, has a lot to do with how you frame the discussion, the inquiry, and the question. So let me rephrase those 5 things and see maybe we can learn some things from Francis. First, the period of Francis was a time of severe conflict between Christians and Muslims, as well as a time of many other wars. Secondly, while most people were illiterate, the universities were just beginning. And of course, that's still the institution with which we are associated. I reminded my students, much to their horror, that when I retired from teaching 2 years ago, I had spent 50 straight years at a university. 8 as a student, 42 as a professor. That sort of scared them a great deal, but we know how important the university is, and not just for people who live in it most of their lives and their entire adult lives. Third, although it was indeed a predominantly rural society, this was an age of urbanization, and Francis was a city man. He's not Francis from the countryside, he's Francis of Assisi, and although Assisi was a relatively small town then, as it is now, it was nevertheless an urban place. Fourth, although it was largely a barter economy, it was a time when Europe was being transformed into a money economy. And as any scholar who knows anything about money will tell us, money changes everything. It's the most single impersonal thing in the world. And the combination of urbanization and a money economy made the world much more hostile for people who were on the edges or beyond those edges. And finally, referring to the statement that virtually everybody went to Mass, it is also true, it's very clear from the sources, that at this time Christianity was becoming increasingly formulaic and remote, especially for lay people. And so if we look at Francis's world that way, conflict between Christians and Muslims, issues of urbanization, new educational institutions we call universities, a money economy, and again, a church that seemed to be, for many people, remote, going to go through the motions if they go through the motions at all. That does sound recognizable to us living in the 21st century. And therefore, if we frame Francis's life that way, I think we can begin to explore what he might be able to teach us, how we might imitate him, not, again, by talking to a flock of pigeons, but in a much more important, although less literal, way. Let me suggest the way that I think Francis responded to those issues in his society, because I believe he acted and spoke articulately about all of them. First of all, the era of the Crusades and war. As I said, St. Francis went to Egypt. Egypt's a long way away from Italy in the 13th century, by the way. He went to the Fifth Crusade. We don't quite know why he went. But when he got there, he was appalled by the Christians and their behavior. And he actually did what we today would call cross enemy lines and went to meet with the Sultan. Now, we don't know, again, exactly what he planned to say to the Sultan or whether he planned anything. Francis was not one of the world's great planners, by the way. And also, we don't know what actually happened. What we do know generally is that he and the Sultan sort of liked each other. And Al-Malik al-Kamil and Francis had some sort of productive, valuable conversation. And we know from things that Francis did when he got back to Italy that he learned some things from his experience in the world of Islam and from his experience with the Sultan. And in fact, he also developed what was then a sort of challenging view of what it meant to be a missionary. The year after Francis went to Egypt, 5 of his brothers went to Morocco. They, we would say today, perhaps got in the face of the Muslim leader and had their heads chopped off. And Francis honored their martyrdom. But in the Rule of 1221 that Francis wrote, which was, by the way, never the official rule of the order, Francis said there are 2 ways of going among the Gentiles, among the Muslims, is what he meant by that. And the first way, he said, is go, tell people you're a Christian, live among them peacefully. Didn't say go preach, go scream, go shout, go threaten, but live among them. Because I think Francis discovered that he had some things to learn. For example, he wrote a letter to all the rulers of the world when he got back. And he said, every evening, have someone loud go through the town and announce that it's time to praise and pray to God. There's really no precedent for this in the Christian world of the Middle Ages in Europe. Of course, there's plenty of precedent for it in the Muslim world. So it seems that although Francis no doubt believed he had truth to impart to the Sultan, he also understands he had things to learn. And it seems to me that's a pretty valuable and important lesson for us to learn today. He also was, although he started out as a warrior in life, he was a peacemaker. He greeted everybody with the word, peace be with you, and he lived a life seeking peace. And he understood that peacemaking was more than formal diplomacy. People of my generation from the United States remember that while thousands of people, Vietnamese, Americans, many others, were being killed in Vietnam, the people at the peace conference spent 18 months, some of you might remember this, in Paris, figuring out the shape of the table. That's not an exaggeration. It's exactly what happened. Francis, I think, would have never fallen into that trap. We have several stories of Francis as peacemaker. Let me just tell you 2 of them briefly, because I think they illustrate Francis's creativity as peacemaker. First of all, we have a story where the mayor, the podesta he was called, and the Bishop of Assisi were having sort of a knockdown, drag-out struggle, no doubt over property. And Francis was too sick to go to them. And so he wrote a second verse to the Canticle of the Creatures, the Canticle of Brother Sun. Blessed are those who seek and give pardon, and blessed are those who live in peace. And Francis commissioned a couple of the friars to go and sing this song to the bishop and the podesta, to sing him a song. These are a couple of hard-nosed guys, and they made peace. Another famous peace story is the fact that there was a vicious wolf around the city of Gubbio that had the bad habit of eating the citizens of Gubbio. And they didn't know what to do, and Francis happened to pass through town, sort of, do something. Well, he did. He went out to meet with the wolf, and he began by greeting the wolf as Brother Wolf. He didn't demonize the wolf, didn't threaten the wolf. He started out by accepting the fact that they are brothers. He then sought to find out what the nature of the problem was, which turns out to be actually very simple. The wolf was hungry. And so he went back to the city of Gubbio and said, let's work out a deal. And the deal is that you feed the wolf, and then the wolf will be nice to you. And in fact, we're told there was a formal pact. There are paintings of the wolf putting his sort of wolf print on a document that's also signed by the city fathers. That might be a sort of creative notion, but at any rate, and so he made peace between the people of Gubbio and the wolf. We don't know to what extent this story is literally true, or to what extent it's a kind of an allegory, but it's a very good story to think about peacemaking, because think about the two stories I told you. Shouldn't Francis have drawn up a document between the mayor and the bishop and sung a song to a beast? Wouldn't that have been more logical? Francis did the unexpected. He did something that was creative. He did something that perhaps made people, and even a wolf, let down their guard a little bit, because this is not what they were expecting. And I think to see Francis as a peacemaker in an era where there is so much violence, internal violence, and of course especially, it seems since September 11th, 2001, so much violence between Christians and Muslims. Francis here is a model of a peacemaker. Let's take the second issue, that is to say the growing universities. Francis was not a scholar. I would call him a B- student in Latin with the equivalent of about an 8th grade education. But Francis respected scholars and scholarship, always did. However, Francis recognized that it's easy for scholars to slip into this notion that the purpose of scholarship is scholarship, that somehow or other learning is an end in itself. Here's the way I would perhaps put it. I'm not using Francis' word, I'm using mine. Francis might ask somebody, what would be the purpose of spending years and years reading every treatise that exists about love if doing all that didn't lead to you becoming better lover? That academics is not about debates to be won, but it's about something much deeper and more profound. And I think that that's an extraordinarily important point too, because after all, we're all in the academic business, all of you students for a while anyway, and some of us are, I guess, what you would call lifers. And let me tell you another story about Francis that I think might help to illustrate this. It's a story involving a Dominican, so if there are any Dominicans here, you know the Dominican's going to lose this one at the beginning, but let me tell it anyway. Dominican comes to Francis in Siena, as it turns out, and says, Brother Francis, I'm just tortured. He said, here's my problem. I read a passage in the prophet Ezekiel, and Ezekiel says, every sinner whom you do not rebuke, you will be held responsible for his sins. And this Dominican said, you know, I don't rebuke everybody I see doing something wrong. And he said, I've read all the commentaries, I've read all the scholarship, and I'm still just tortured by this. Now again, Francis was not a scholar. Francis said to the Dominican, if you live your life well, you are rebuking every sinner. That what this Dominican did not find in a pile of treatises, no doubt very learned, very brilliant, he found from the simple words of Francis of Assisi. And I think that's a lesson that probably is good for all of us who spend part of our lives in academia. One of the things you know about urban life is that you see the poor in ways you don't see them in rural areas. I live in a little village, smaller than Maynooth, if you can imagine that. And we don't have poor people living on the heating grates on the sidewalk, because we don't have heating grates on our sidewalks. And in fact, I will ask some of my students, are there any poor people in our town? And they'll say no. I'll say there are a lot of people in our town that are poor. We have a housing area for people who are very poor, but we plant trees in front of them so you can't see it from the street. And more than that, we have desperately poor people living in our rural areas, but to that you've got to get off the highway, let alone get out of town, if you're going to see them. But poverty becomes not only more extreme, but also more visible in an urban world. And that was a problem. And if you add to that the notion that the money economy is taking over, that doubles the problem. Because as we always hear from economists of every kind, you know, the economists will say, money makes winners and losers. And certainly then, perhaps now too, there are more losers than winners. And if you have urban poor, you see them, you experience them, but also they're cut off from even the least food supply. They might be able to gather some things in the woods or glean a field if they're out in the country. But when they come to the city, they don't see that. We can see this especially in some of the barrios that go around so many Latin American cities. I was in Lima once and took a tour through the barrios. And you really see that. They're divorced from the land, they're divorced from their families who've been left behind on the land, and there's a kind of desperation about them. Cities are not always happy places. We tend to celebrate the great achievements of urban life in the Middle Ages, or think about a great urban center like a London or a Florence or a Paris, but we need to remember that the totality of the reality is very different. And money is a problem too, because we all know that, and probably we're all guilty of it, it's very easy to start ranking people by how much money they have. It's very easy to treat with great respect people with a lot of money and fancy clothes, as opposed to somebody who hasn't bathed in a week and is in rags. And I think all of us have in some ways experienced that. And how does Francis respond to all of this? Well, when he was a young man, he was working in his father's cloth merchant store, and one day a beggar walked in, begging money. And Francis did what a lot of shopkeepers would do. He kicked him out. This is not the kind of image we want for our cloth store. But very quickly, Francis came to understand he'd done something wrong. He went after the beggar, gave the beggar some money, but more than that, never forgot the lesson and never forgot the tendency. He also one time went to Rome on a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Peter. And when he went there, he prayed and felt consolation and did what a merchant would do. Took out a lot of money and threw it inside the grate where the tomb of St. Peter was. That's how the wealthy respond. If they get something nice, they want to give you money. And Francis was for a while caught up in all this. But he sort of caught himself. He came to realize this is not the way he wanted to live, and this is not the way that Christ called him to live. And so ultimately, of course, he lived as a beggar. He gave away everything, and he moved out of town. The little church of the Porziuncola is not very far from Assisi, but we also know for a while he lived with the most wretched of the earth, the lepers, in a leper colony called a leprosarium outside the gates of Assisi. Remember, at that time, if a leper left the leprosarium, he had to take a noisemaker with him. And if he saw any human being around, he had to make noise so that they would know to avoid him. And Francis went to live with the lepers. He tells us this is one of the most important experiences of his life. He says, when I was in sin, this is his very brief biographical statement just at the end of his life. When I was in sin, he said that he first came to embrace a leper, and then after that, leaving the world, by which he meant leaving the worldly values, was pretty easy. And so Francis, too, talks to us here more by action than by words in dealing with an urbanized society, or at least an increasingly urbanized society, and in dealing with the issue caused by a money economy. There's a poet from the 14th century from Siena named Cecco Angiolieri. And he wrote poems back and forth with Dante. Unfortunately, we don't have Dante's response to his. But at any rate, one of his poems begins, Florins, that is, say, the money of Florence, the gold coin of Florence, Florins are the best of kin. He said, if you have relatives, they can let you down, they can do all these things, but if you got gold in your pocket, you're secure. And that's the world that Francis came to recognize was not the world that Christ called us to live in, not the world he was going to choose to live in. Not by running away to the countryside, but by engaging it and radically separating himself from what he saw as the essence of the problem. And that's very powerful, to be both separated and engaged at the same time. This last issue that I mentioned, that is, say, the issue of people taking church for granted, everybody going, but it kind of became routine, Francis addressed that too. And first of all, he gave long, and I mean long, vernacular sermons, not at the Mass, because he was, although a deacon, he didn't preach very often in church. He gave them out in the piazzas. And he spoke the language of the people, not an exalted language that very often came from the pulpit. But perhaps the most powerful story is when in 1223 in the little hamlet of Geneseo, for the midnight mass for Christmas, he brought in an ox and an ass and a manger and some straw. Because what he realized is that people were commemorating God's entry into the world back in Bethlehem a long time ago. They weren't experiencing Christ continuing to come in the world. That is to say, that Christianity had become commemoration and not experience. And by bringing in, Francis was no dummy. He knew what an ox and an ass were going to do in that church during a couple hours of Mass. And that's what he wanted, because that's the condition in which God came into the world in human form in Bethlehem so many years ago and so far away. And that, too, is a good lesson about that need for experience and not just commemoration. Now, a few months ago, as you know, there was a great shock in the world when somebody who was not regarded as papabile, Jorge Maria Bergoglio, was elected as Pope. And more than that, to the shock of many, including a lot of people who know the Vatican and the Church well, were shocked by the name he took. He didn't become a something the 8th or a something the 19th, or he could have been John the 24th or Gregory whatever, with lots of Roman numerals, sort of look like Super Bowls in the United States. He chose to become Pope Francis. Now, Francis was canonized in 1228. He'd been a saint a long time. And no pope, including several Franciscans who were popes, ever chose the name Francis. And so the question is, what was he doing? What was he thinking? By the way, the press was so startled by this that the first word on the street, if you will, was that he had named himself for the second saint of the Jesuit order, Francis Xavier. Next day, Pope Francis cleared that up and said, no, it's Francis of Assisi. Now, first of all, we have to say that by choosing the name Francis, he set an impossibly, perhaps, high standard and knows how he's going to be looked at and critiqued by the world. Everybody thinks he knows or she knows something about St. Francis. And therefore, when you look at the Pope, you're going to say, I don't think Francis would have done that, or Francis didn't wear that, or Francis didn't do X, Y, or Z. And so he's going to certainly receive a lot of criticism. One of the reasons the Franciscans were so vilified sometimes in the later Middle Ages is because they were easy to vilify. A lot of people didn't know anything about St. Dominic, but everybody knew something about Francis. They'd seen pictures of him on the walls of their churches, they'd heard stories about him, and so it was very easy to look at contemporary friars and say, these guys are bums. Francis didn't wear sandals. Francis didn't do this. Francis didn't say that. And the friars were all, read Chaucer. Chaucer doesn't make fun of Dominicans. Chaucer makes fun of Franciscans. They're easy. They're sitting ducks in some real way. And to some extent, we have to think that the Holy Father also realizes what he's in for, that he's going to be looked at by the standard of the name of the man he chose. Let me suggest then a couple reasons why I think he might have taken on this task. What things do we know about Francis to perhaps help us understand who Pope Francis believes he is and why he chose that name? Francis, in about the year 1206, was praying in the little tumble-down church of San Damiano, outside the gates of Assisi. And a crucifix spoke to him, and it said, Francis, go and rebuild my church, which, as you can see, is falling into ruin. Now, Francis took it very literally and went to get some mortar and some rocks to fix up this little chapel. But at least according to his greatest biographer, Bonaventure, God had something else in mind. He meant the church, not a church building. And also, though, lest this seem like kind of a radical thing to do, as Thomas of Celano, his first biographer, said, that Francis' job was to rebuild an old church, not to make a new church. That he built on the foundations that were there, he did not create new foundations. A model of reform. After all, reform means to form again. And so I think Pope Francis is announcing with the choice of that name that he's going to reform the church. He's not going to tear it down and start over. He's not going to ignore all that's there in the foundations that's good and strong. But the church needs repair. And I think Francis, the Pope, is announcing fairly clearly to me that he seeks to reform the church. And certainly almost all the commentary on the first now 10 months of his pontificate, almost 11 months of his pontificate, is that he's worked pretty quickly in certain areas to reform the church. Whether it's appointing a commission to do this, whether it's dealing with the Vatican Bank, or whatever it might be. But it's not just the institution that Francis is repairing in the formal sense of fixing this office or getting a new guy in here, but he's obviously also repairing the church in the sense that we saw him washing the feet of women, of Muslims, of juvenile delinquents on Holy Thursday, and we saw him have his birthday breakfast with some homeless men from the city of Rome. That too is rebuilding that wonderful church that we all know. The second event I think that's so important in Francis the Pope choosing this name is the story of Francis of Assisi's renunciation of goods before the bishop. A great theatrical event, at least the way the story is told. That is to say that Francis had given away some of his father's property, so his dad basically takes him to court and said, "We're going to separate everything and you're no longer my heir." And so when he asked Francis back for all that was his, the father's, Francis starts taking off his clothes because they belonged to his father. I always think, although they left this out of the medieval accounts, I always think the dad probably said to him, "You can keep the underwear." But he didn't. He stood there stark naked. The bishop had to come up and put his cloak around him. It's kind of an interesting scene, and it's often interestingly depicted. And if you ever saw the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, you'll know the scene was interminable. The director of the film, Zeffirelli, just couldn't get enough of the naked Francis, it seemed to me. But at any rate, Bonaventure says that when Francis gave all his cloak back and clothes, he then said, "For the first time, I can freely and completely say that my Father is our Father who art in heaven." That this was a liberating thing to get rid of these worldly attachments, to live kind of on the edge, without stability, and to allow God to care for him. And I think later on in his life, as Francis thought about what does it mean to take seriously saying that my Father is our Father who art in heaven. Well, here's part of the answer to that. The reason he's my Father is because God made me. But God also made the Sultan, the leper, birds, wolves, rocks, and therefore everything that is in some very real way for Francis a family. And the challenge is, how do you live in a world in which everything is family? What kinds of behavior are no longer acceptable? Not just with your equals or your peers, but with anything, if we're all brothers and sisters, as Francis, of course, articulates so beautifully in the first Italian poem, the Canticle of the Creatures, the Canticle of Brother Sun and Sister Moon. So I think that this renunciation was not, renunciation sounds sort of negative. For Francis, it was positive. It was liberating. And I think that the Pope Francis is looking at this and saying, how can the church liberate itself, not from every brick or reliquary it owns, not going to sell off all the church's property, as some people feared, by the way, in the press after they heard a few of Pope Francis's words, but rather, how are we going to liberate ourselves from the burden, sometimes a burden we have to bear. I was in Kenya recently, I was talking to a very, very progressive and somewhat angry priest, and he had lots of things to complain about. But he said, of all the charitable money that comes into sub-Saharan Africa, 2 out of every $5 is brought by the Catholic Church. And he said, I'm very, very proud of that. So we understand that the church cannot divest itself of everything, sell all of its buildings, melt down all of its crosses. But I think Pope Francis is going to be looking for ways that the church can be liberated from so many of the burdens of being an old and wealthy institution in many ways. So I think that we need to consider Francis and the choosing of this name, and perhaps these two events, the hearing of the crucifix speaking at San Damiano and the stripping himself naked, are perhaps ways we can begin to understand what this Pope is going to be about. Let me suggest that my good host here, Professor Ryan, pointed out I wrote a book called Francis, The Way of Poverty and Humility. And not long after I wrote it, I realized it wasn't a very good title. It should have been Francis, The Way of Poverty, what did I just say? What did I just say? My God, what's the name of my own book? Poverty, humility, and simplicity. That's what I should have added simplicity. Now, if you think about poverty and humility and simplicity, you don't automatically think of the Vatican. I think we have to say that. And let me suggest some of the ways that the poverty and the simplicity and the humility of Francis are good models. And yet, again, it's hard to imagine a pope living by those particular principles because the church is a wealthy institution. Because how do you be humble when your title is head of state and vicar of Christ? Those are not exactly sort of humbling titles. And can you imagine simplicity? If you think you got a busy calendar, imagine his. And as the sort of treasurer of all that treasure of the church, and I'm not talking about now jewels in reliquaries, I'm talking about the doctrinal treasure that we have, the treasure of the church fathers. Imagine how difficult it is to understand and then try to live out that way for 1 billion plus Catholics. So by choosing his name of someone who really sought poverty, humility, and simplicity, how do you do that as the Holy Father? And let me suggest some of the obvious, perhaps, contrasts between Pope Francis and St. Francis. St. Francis valued instability. He, like Jesus, didn't have any place to rest his head. And imagine the love of instability and the sometimes opaque quality of the Vatican bureaucracy. Or if we think about humility, well, once again, you don't usually attach humility to Time Magazine's Man of the Year. And one of the things I think that Francis learned was that because he was probably the most famous Catholic in Europe when he died, he was one of those automatic saints, sort of like people regarded Mother Teresa, for example, or the late John Paul II. How do you live with that? Because if you pick up the paper, you've already been canonized, in a sense. And you know better than to believe that stuff, but it's sort of tempting. Francis essentially never believed his own press clippings. And I think we're seeing that in Pope Francis. And that's very difficult to do. Francis of Assisi said, if I knock on a monastery door one night looking for a place to live, and I'm kicked out because I'm sort of dirty and dumb and everything else, I have to accept that exactly the same way I would accept a gracious invitation to come in. That you can't just say, well, wait a minute, I'm Francis of Assisi, or, hey, I've taken the same kind of vows you guys have taken, or anything like that. That Francis recognized the criticism and the praise you have to accept equally, which means probably with some real conditions in both cases. But Francis understood that, Francis the Saint, and I think that Francis the Pope understands that as well. Now, let me also suggest that simplicity is difficult for a pope. But I think one of the things that Francis of Assisi understood, that Francis the Pope understands, is that everything we have in life is gift. Everything we have in some real way is on loan from God. Francis's rule was, even if you've got only a grubby habit, brother, you've got to give it to somebody if anybody needs it worse than you do. Because it's on loan. And it's your obligation to do that. And so I think that's something the Pope is going to explore. How do we, as an institution, how do we, as church, do these things? How do we recognize that everything is gift, everything is on loan, everything is to be shared in ways that are appropriate? And I think that's a challenge. I remember once I was in a Franciscan church in Rome, And they have all these beautiful reliquaries. This is Santi Cosmo Damiano. And I met a friar from America, so we got talking. And he said, we want to give all these monstrances and chalices and stuff away to the poorest countries. But technically they belong to the Italian government, and therefore they're not ours to give away. But the church does have things to give away, not just physical things, but we all know the value of time as well as the value of treasure. And I think that Francis's simplicity is going to be in part expressed by saying we need to remember that things we have are gifts, the things we have are on loan, that things we have are not absolute but contingent, and that the church needs to spend its wealth, again, its time as well as its treasure. And we need to do that. That ultimately, I think, however complicated the world is, I think that it's important also to recognize there's some simple principles that don't need hundreds of pages of commentary in order to be carried out. I also think that Francis's simplicity has made it easier for the Pope to talk to other Christians. Patriarch Bartholomew was at his installation. The Coptic Pope has been to visit. So has the Armenian Patriarch, already been to Rome to visit. And I think that same simplicity, that same willingness to be open to what contributions others make is making it easier for the Pope to have dialogues with religions other than Christianity. For example, he wrote a fairly unread book in 2010 that he co-authored with the chief rabbi of Buenos Aires, a book that was only in Spanish and that very few people read. Now, of course, it's translated into English. But he had this wonderful set of dialogues with the chief rabbi of Buenos Aires. You can all read now. And it's quite an extraordinary interfaith dialogue. It's a model interfaith dialogue, something he's already experienced before he was chosen as a vicar of Christ. And I think when Francis chose this name, that is, say, Pope Francis chose this name, he, again, realized certain things. You know, when Benedict chose his name, Pope Benedict, it was interesting because, once again, you listen to CNN, and they're all going back and saying, well, who's Pope Benedict XV? And, or was it the 14th, or was it the Benedict somebody else? And, of course, ultimately, the Holy Father said it was actually St. Benedict. Well, nobody's going to say about anything that Pope Benedict did, boy, he's not living up to the standards of fill in the blank. Most people don't know who the Popes Benedict were, and ultimately relatively few people know much about St. Benedict. But again, when you choose Francis, you're choosing to be under the spotlight. You're choosing to be held up to a high standard. In fact, just last week in my local newspaper, the Rochester, New York Democrat and Chronicle, or as we call it, the Demagogue and Comical, there was a letter to the editor just chastising the Pope for not doing enough for birds. And maybe that's not the most serious criticism he will face, but we know that people are constantly going to be holding up next to him that most famous and well-known saint in our tradition. Well, what I'm suggesting, of course, is that what Pope Francis is doing is taking St. Francis of Assisi, knowing about him, and very carefully and creatively trying to live the Franciscan charism as Pope, a very different job than Francis had. Francis wasn't very good at administration. He kind of got pushed aside in his own order that he founded during his own lifetime, for example. So clearly, you can't just do what Francis did. You can't wear a tattered robe and wander around the streets of Rome, although apparently, at least according to some of the stories, the Pope does sneak out at night every now and then and hangs out with homeless people, a really interesting notion in and of itself. But being Pope is a very different job than being the founder of a mendicant order. And so I see Francis as someone, Pope Francis, as someone who really, with interesting creativity and knowledge, it's not a matter of one or the other, it's having both of them, is able to say, I'm going to take the life of somebody who lived 800 years ago, a continent away from where I lived, even though, of course, he's sort of Argentinian Italian, and I'm going to try to take his wisdom, his virtue, And I'm going to try to live according to the way he lived in the job as the Vicar of Christ. And my own view so far is done pretty well. After all, it's been less than a year. It's hard to imagine he's been Pope less than a year. With all the changes that have taken place and all the new enthusiasm that so many people have experienced. And of course, time will tell. But I think it's important to see, therefore, that Francis is not just the Vicar of Christ. I would suggest for all of us, and not just for Catholics, he's a model of someone who does history right. He looks at a great figure of the past and he knows the stories. He doesn't just sort of take a popular whim or idea of what Francis is, and then he tries to live that in a creative way that makes him and St. Francis relevant to the whole church in the 21st century. So I wanted to start out with a big question. How is history useful? How do we do it and take it seriously? How do we do both the research and the creativity? And I would suggest that we look to the Holy Father for many things, obviously. He is, at least for me, I hope he is for you, a model of someone who also is, in the very best and fullest sense of the word, a great Christian historian. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cook, for a very lively and thought-provoking and very positive lecture. So we now have some time for questions, and if you could keep your question as short and to the point as possible, because what we're going to do is Professor Cook will repeat the question very quickly for purposes of our recording here tonight. So if you keep your questions quite concise, and we'll open the floor for the next 15 minutes or so. Thank you.
I'm going to wander down among you simply because my hearing isn't too good, and I want to make sure I hear the question I then have to repeat. So who has any questions or thoughts or comments?
I think it was Karl Rahner, a great German theologian, who once said, he said a number of times, I think it's theological investigations. He said, few people have the capacity to understand the complexity of modern society. Then he went on, he said, the problem of the world is a theological event and an intellectual one of huge proportions. Recently, the Brazilian bishops, based communities that met for this they have been going on now for 37 years. The Bishop of Brazil said this: the bishops don't understand the issues of society. Now, some would regard Karl Rahner as the way above the ordinary, totally irrelevant. Now, I think, are they combining are they coming together, those two notions?
Well, there are a lot of interesting things about that we can say. The question really is about the fact that the world is extraordinarily complex, obviously in the 21st century. Talked a little bit about the Brazilian bishops, and it has to do, I think, at least implicitly with liberation theology and the base communities in Brazil and so on. And how does this all come together? I don't know whether Pope Francis is a great intellectual. The only book I've read of his is this conversation he had with the rabbi, which was pastoral rather than scholarly, certainly. I don't know if he's a first-rate intellect. But I think what he has and what he needs is, he's smart enough, plenty smart enough, to be able to take seriously the issues of the day. We don't solve problems by pretending they really are all simple and have two-word answers. I think he understands the complexity of the world. On the other hand, we can certainly move forward being guided by, although we have to apply them in the right way, some very simple fundamental principles. One of the great lines I ever heard, there was a very famous American golfer named Bobby Jones. And somebody asked him one day, how did you become such a great golfer, Bobby Jones? Bobby Jones said, well, my daddy gave me a club and a ball, and that made it pretty simple. Well, of course, it isn't that simple. A lot of practice and presumably some intrinsic talent worked on that too. But ultimately, the formulas that we have sometimes don't need to have tons of footnotes, don't need to have a piece at the end, an appendix that's longer than the principle we're trying to discuss. And I think that Francis understands that he's not going to dumb down things, as is a tendency of some politicians. If we just did this, the world would be fine. I don't think that's where he's going at all. But I do think he has that balance between a grasp and understanding of it and the fact that having an intellectual understanding, whether it's from an economist or a political scientist or a theologian, that's not enough. And that you need the guidance of the gospel. And I think certainly Francis, to some extent, saying, I find particularly useful the guidance of the gospel as mediated by the life and words of Francis of Assisi. And I think, his Latin American heritage is very interesting because when he became Pope, it became fairly clear that he had been very critical of a lot of Latin American liberation theology, and that made some people very worrisome. After all, there is a long history of very conservative prelates in Latin America. And yet it's become clear to me that whatever Francis has said about liberation theology, or at least some of its elements, that he's basically accepted some of the premises. That is to say, premises of listening to all sorts of people. I always like the fact that Leonardo Boff says, the real experts on poverty are the poor. Some people study it, they live it every day. And if you're going to understand poverty, you talk to the poor. And I think Francis understands that and has demonstrated that, whether it is wanting to talk to homeless people over breakfast at his birthday, or 100 other examples we've already had. And I think that's an important principle. I also think that he has a certain sense of social justice. It might not take some of the same political forms as certain Latin American theologians have taken. But, Argentina has a lot of very, very poor people. He's lived through the time of a dictatorship. He doesn't have the luxury that God knows Americans have and many Europeans have. And therefore, I think that he has a lot of sensitivities that he's going to bring to this, as well as his intellect, as well as his own perceptions of what the gospel means. And my sense is these various elements of him are coming together in a really remarkable form. But I think sometimes when newspapermen especially write about this, they talk about the Latin America stuff, and they talk about the fact that he's a well-educated Jesuit and all these sort of things, but they leave out Francis. And it seems to me if you're leaving out Francis, you are leaving out, in some ways, the figure that helped to bring these pieces into play with one another and to develop a real plan for carrying out not only reform in the church institutionally, but a reform really of the heart of Christians. And in that way, I think it's a remarkable synthesis that he's building for us. Yes?
I was just kind of conscious that about action speaking louder than words, and Pope Francis obviously using this very well. But I'm also reminded of St. Francis when he would say, go and preach to the nations, and if necessary, to use words. So is that contradiction? That it's that mirroring of both, really.
I think that's very important. Again, that commonly used phrase about St. Francis that he allegedly said to some of the guys, some of the friars, go and preach, and if necessary, use words. And I think we have seen that kind of response from the Holy Father. In the book that he wrote with Rabbi Skorka, he says that when he hears confessions, especially from the very wealthy, he asks them if they've given to the poor. And they all say yes. And then he asks them, did you put the money or the gift, whatever it is, in the hands of the poor? And most of the time, the answer, of course, is no. They sent a check to the Red Cross or whatever it might be. And Pope Francis, then Cardinal Bergoglio, said, and then I scold them for not being very good Christians because it's not enough to send a check. What you need to do is be in contact with the poor. You need to see them face to face. You need to talk with them. You need to experience them in some real way. And I think, this seems to me to be the Franciscan core of it all. I think in some ways, again, Francis thinks very simply, clearly, but simply. Now, what's so hot about poverty that you give away all your goods? Well, Francis' answer is very simple. When God became human, God became human poor. Could have been born in a palace, could have come as a full-fledged adult, could have had nice clothes. But no, it's that stable in Bethlehem that Francis recreated at Geneseo in 1223. That sort of says it all. That's what God chose. And that dignifies all the poor. And it means that, I think, just as Mother Teresa would say as well, I mean, she was a great lover of Francis of Assisi, that I always liked her line that say, you know, the poor are Jesus in distressing disguises. And I think Francis says that not in those words, and I think the Pope, Francis, is also one who recognizes that when you look in the face of a poor person, you're looking at something much more like Christ became when he was human than somebody you go see with a suit on and somebody who has a big bank account. And therefore, it's vital to your life as a Christian because you'll see that reflection of Jesus. I mean, Jesus says it himself in Matthew 25. And so I think Francis is very sensitive to that, and that is, say, the Pope, because I think Francis the Saint was sensitive to that. Again, in some real ways, this is perhaps too simple to put it, Francis of Assisi is saying, if that's what God chose, then that's what I'm going to choose. If it's good enough for God, in God's go-around as being human, it's good enough for me and mine. And let me point out, though, that Francis was never a scold. And that's another quality about this Pope that people have remarked. Francis never said to rich guys, there are a couple of stories that may have a little bit of historical truth to them, but he never said to the Pope or to a merchant in Assisi, get rid of everything. Because part of Francis' humility was, very famous story, he's walking along with a friar one day, and this friar says, Francis, what do you think of yourself? And Francis said, I am the worst of sinners. And you sort of see this other friar saying, oh, come on. You know, there's some really bad guys out there, you know, murderers and whatever. What do you mean you're the worst of sinners? And he said, this is Francis of Assisi's answer. I know the gifts that I've received from God, and I know how imperfectly I've used them. I don't know about the gifts everybody else receives from God. So, in a sense, Francis of Assisi almost says what the Pope said in one of his most famous statements of the press. Who am I to judge? I know where I failed, because I know what God has given me, and God's given me a lot. I don't know what God's given these other people. And so we have to be humble, recognizing our own sinfulness, not by some standard of have I been arrested or have I committed a certain category of sin, but have I taken the gifts I've received and used them as God intended? And I think we all know we fall short on that. And therefore, that humility of Francis and that notion again, he's the greatest of sinners, you know, it'd be easy to sort of poo-poo that and say that's sort of false humility. It's sort of, you know, Michael Jordan, if you follow old American basketball, saying, you know, I wasn't a bad basketball player once. You know, come on. That's kind of false humility. But Francis, it was true humility, and humility has consequences. And the incarnation has consequences. And the consequences, again, when God chose to become human, God chose to become human in a stable, in an outpost among a persecuted people in the Roman Empire. And I think, in a sense, Francis of Assisi might say, you don't need to know much else. You really don't need to know much else. And I have this sense that the Pope, in his own way, in his own language, in his own style, with his own charism, is also embodying that Franciscan principle. Anything else? Well, I've kept you a long time. I certainly enjoyed being here. Let me thank you all once again for your hospitality.
So once again, I'd like to extend on all our behalfs a very great word of gratitude to Professor Cook for being with us tonight, for, as I said, a very lively, very memorable lecture. So once again, a very heartfelt thank you to Professor William Cook tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.